I think it's a little bit of a stretch for me and maybe for my viewers as well to extrapolate from America as a failing empire center to China and on-chain. Like, how did you make the leap logically from the US is possibly failing and then the other options are China or the internet?
Okay, so let me show you a bunch of graphs, right? Here we go. The network states of the internet. The internet is not a place, but there will be internet places. And so I wrote this book called The Network State, right? And we've opened Network School over here to take some of the ideas from the book and turn them into reality, because there's theory and then there's practice, right? Okay. So let me give the thesis of the whole thing, right? American empire was real and it was spectacular, but it's ending now because China is strong and Zeihan is wrong. Okay, do you know this guy, Peter Zeihan?
I have no idea.
Okay, he's somebody who I have no personal beef with her, but he writes a bunch of books about how China's going to collapse and America's going to withdraw from the world, but the rest of the world is going to be totally done without America and so on and so forth. Okay, fine. China's strong, Zeihan is wrong because he identifies lots of the correct axes, but has the sign wrong. For example, he thought the U.S. is going to be able to navally blockade China. Actually, China's navally blockading the U.S., where China's proxy, Iran, has its proxy, the Houthis, that have successfully blockaded America in the
Middle East Gulf.
In the Middle East,
Yeah.
That's right. So because China's strong, Zion is wrong, it will be in part a Chinese century, but it won't solely be a Chinese century. It will also be an internet century. And the future is China versus the internet. Those are the two heirs to American empire. China inherits the physical empire, but the internet inherits American values. And from them, we build the network states of the internet. Okay, so let me explain. All right, so first, the American century. Okay, so when I say American empire was real and it was spectacular, there's actually a very good book called Tomorrow the World, which puts a finger on the exact moment when the U.S. decided to become an empire, right? It was actually 1939, 1940. See, up till that point, the conventional wisdom has been among Americans, let the British run an empire. That's expensive, that's troublesome, and so on. Let them do all that stuff. We're just going to build up our strength at home, right? However, after the fall of France in 1939 at the hands of the Nazis, a bunch of Americans realized, wait a second, if we don't build an empire, the Nazis will, or maybe the Soviets will, and then they're going to blockade us with sea lanes, all this kind of stuff, right? So you realize, actually, there's no, if we don't play for number one, someone else will get the crown. So a bunch of intentional decisions were taken at that point to actually gear America into something it had not been before, which is global empire, okay? So the reason for that, by the way, is obviously you don't become global number one in every category by accident.
Right? No, you don't.
Right? You don't,
Yes.
right? So there's a bunch of Americans who are in this weird mental state where they're like, America's global number one and all this stuff. And oh, by the way, we didn't mean to do that. It just kind of happened. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So clearly there was intent by at least some people to set a bunch of institutions there. For example, with the UN, it's set up in such a way that, yes, everybody has a vote, but there's the 5 Security Council members. And oh, by the way, it's in New York City. So guess what? They can have all kinds of surveillance apparatus. They can monitor, camera, photograph everybody going there, blah, blah, blah. So they have a backdoor into the UN, right? Okay. So American empire was real and was spectacular. And from 1991 to the present day, the U.S. was basically the most dominant empire of all time, right? And, the largest military. And this is when the left and the right of America worked together well, because the left did the diplomacy, because it's really hard. But if you've ever gotten 10 people to sign something, right? Then imagine how hard it is to get 10 companies to sign something. Now imagine how hard it is to get 10 countries to sign something. And now imagine how hard it is to get every country in the world to sign something. That was the skill of American diplomats, to get like global consensus on things like, WTO or the UN, like getting all of these people to sign on the line that was dotted, non-trivial, okay? Very underrated. And once you start thinking about diplomacy in terms of business negotiation, and then when that broke down, of course, they had their powerful military, right? So they had, they'd punch them until they signed.
Right.
Okay.
Or they threaten them until they sign.
Yeah,
Yes, right.
exactly. That's right. And to be clear, I think on balance, the U.S. was better than the USSR during this period, right? When you look at West Germany versus East Germany, when you look at South Korea versus North Korea, when you look at Cuba, or Chile versus Cuba, like I'm not saying every single thing the U.S. did during this period was good, but on balance, American aligned things did better. They were capitalist, they were doing well. Okay. So America was just completely unmatched in history, especially post-1991. Okay. So American empire is ending now, right? One way of thinking about it is 4 of the most important factions, which are Red America, Blue America, Tech America, and China, all want the end of the current post-war order. Why? Red America is against the deep state, right? Blue America opposes the Trump administration. Tech America is against the regulatory state. And China opposes U.S. hegemony. Okay? So all four, are you a math guy, physics guy?
Well, I'm enough.
A little bit. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Fine. So if you remember like vectors, like force diagrams, right?
Right.
So, if you take this object, right, which is like the current U.S. structure, all four forces are pointed down in a way that hasn't happened in our lifetime.
Right.
It's kind of like a solar eclipse or something, like everything is aligned in a way, right? So the only thing that's keeping U.S. institutions in their current state is just their historical state.
Legacy.
Right. That's right. So forces are pointed down, so the dynamics will be down, right?
Got it.
Moreover, the U.S. is already socially disintegrated. This is from 2017. It showed that Twitter had partitioned where blues only talk to blues and reds only talk to reds. And now, 8 years later, it's actually completely fragmented. When Elon took over X, Twitter is now over, right? And so what do you have? You have on the right, you have X, and you have Gab and Truth and so on and so forth. And on the left, you have Blue Sky and Mastodon and Threads and TikTok, right? And then you have crypto networks like Farcaster and Nostr and Lens. So it's a Tower of Babel moment where Twitter is just fragmented, and now there's a bunch of ideologically different Twitters, right? And what that means is that you got millions of people on these networks, right? They are speaking English, but they're not talking to each other. It's like in Korea, there is no Korea. There's only North Korea and South Korea. So there is no America. There's only Blue America and Red America. They have different words. They have different premises, right? Everything they're thinking about is just different,
Yep.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is when you have that level of digital separation, digital partition, that is going to get printed out in the physical world. And for example, Democrats going and firebombing Teslas, right? That kind of stuff, right? That is something where they don't consider themselves part of the same tribe anymore, right? That is tribal warfare, reprisals. And of course, the old world saw this. This is what, the 20th century was like for India in many ways, right? Partition, all this kind of stuff. That is the kind of thing that's coming to America, okay? And the one way of thinking about this is anything that's important, it happens on the internet first, then it gets printed out in the physical world. For example, you do a Google Doc, you print it, right? Or you have a Flipkart or Amazon order, and you hit, in a sense, print, and you print it out to your front door, right? Or you have like a ride-sharing ride, and then you hit print, in a sense, and the car comes to your front door, right? So things happen on the internet first nowadays, and then they get printed out in the physical world. So this level of cognitive, social separation, the only thing that's keeping them together right now is the dollar. Because, for example, I can show the graphs. You know what percentage of Democrats marry Republicans?
I think under 10%.
It's 4%.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So that is something that it's no longer like a political disalignment. That is when ideology becomes biology in one generation.
Right.
Okay?
No, it's a ideological separation like nothing I've seen in India.
Yes.
I went out on dates in America, and if I as much as mentioned that I would vote for Trump as a joke, the date's over.
Yes.
It's a very interesting thing.
Yeah.
It almost never seems to happen anywhere else.
No, that's right. So basically, that is in the process of it is digital secession. Right. It's social secession and so on. This is what predates these groups breaking up, right? Mm-hmm. Physically breaking up. Now, the problem is it's fractal. It's like Yugoslavia or the Balkans. It's not something where you have a clearly delineated, easy blue and red area where it's 99%, 99%. Probably, by the way, had it been to that point, that would have come to organized blows long before this. It'll be more like partition where it was just a mess, and you're going to have blues going to blue states and reds going to red states in this giant mess. This is already happening, right? Okay. So the thing is that A, these four forces are aligned against the order. B, the people have broken up, right? And then C, after the tariffs, 190 countries are seeking alternatives to American empire, right? The thing about this, though, is it's not just ending in the internal sense, also ending as a hub for global business. For example, Delaware, which had generations of reputation for stability, that's just going away. Companies are just pulling out of Delaware, right? And once you've pulled out of that, well, the whole thing is up for grabs, right? Where will things get incorporated? And I think the answer is eventually going to be in China or on chain, right? Because a truly stable, corporate entity would be something that has smart contracts on chain. Then you can just move it between jurisdictions, just like when you move from place to place. Your cryptocurrency remains intact, your email remains intact, your laptop remains intact. Anything that's digital is actually robust in a way the physical isn't, right? And of course, China will have its own recipe. I'll come back to that.
Right.
So the point is, though, that if you add up across ideologies, in America, they're shooting CEOs, they're bombing Teslas, unrealized cap gains taxes are getting proposed in, that was a serious proposal by Biden's. They're abolishing the police. They're blocking all the student, tourist, and worker visas. They're slashing research funding. They've corrupted Delaware. They've imposed these unprecedented tariffs. When you add all that up across ideologies, America doesn't want to be an empire anymore. It doesn't want to be the center. It may think it's in its interest for it to not be an empire, but it's basically cutting off foreign talent. It's cutting off foreign trade. It is, breaking up internally, socially. It's not one thing. It's like 20 things that I just mentioned, right? Okay. And so this is actually something which is a function of the fact that the world economy has moved back to Asia. Okay, so this is a very important graph. It shows that for thousands of years, the center of the world economy was basically in Eurasia. And what that means, it's like an average of, historical Japan and China and India and the Middle East and Europe and so on and so forth, just using approximations for where the historical capitals were. Okay. Then with the Industrial Revolution, for hundreds of years, it moved out to Europe and then America. And 1950 was peak America, peak West, peak centralization, where everybody else was bombed out or they were under socialism, communism, Eastern Europe, like Japan had gotten nuked. Everybody was just in ruins. And that is a moment that all these post-war order institutions were set up when America was at its absolute zenith of all time, right? So that's a very unnatural state of the world where everybody else is in ruins and only America is left standing, right? Then, that persisted for a few decades. And then after 1991, the U.S. was still, even more super powerful because, the Soviet Union fell in. But that was the true peak. Right after 1991, like a rubber band snapping, the world economy came rocketing back to Eurasia, right? Because of China, but also because of the rise of Southeast Asia, rise of India. India started liberalizing around that time. Everybody stopped basically hitting themselves in the head with socialism and communism, right? So all these countries that had been socialist and communist in the 20th century, like Vietnam, like India and so on, suddenly became capitalist. So they started producing. And then conversely, many of the countries that were capitalist, like Western Europe and the US, basically just became degenerate, right? They just were so wealthy, they forgot how to build wealth. Not everybody, but certainly a large fraction of the population. The non-internet people disproportionately became, they weren't building things from scratch anymore. They weren't feeling the pain of building, right? They were inheriting something that they hadn't built, okay? So again, not all non-internet people, blah, blah, not all Americans, but a good chunk of them essentially took the wealth for granted, right? And you can see this even more in Western Europe in some ways, right? Okay, so the point is that wealth has already rocketed back out over here. This is an enormous change. This took thousands of years. This happened over hundreds of years. This happened in tens of years. Most GDP is in Asia. Most millionaires are in Asia, or Eurasia especially. The number one and number two destinations for global millionaires are Dubai and Singapore, right? And on, right? The world economy has actually come back out over here. So what's happening here with the end of, American empire is actually a lagging indicator, right? And the issue is Americans think that by rights, the world should be centered in the U.S. They'll often say, in 1950, a guy who was a high school graduate, he could have a wife and a house, and it was fine, and so on. And that was true for a tiny percentage of the world because a Polish guy who was like a really smart and hardworking guy was a slave under communism, right? Or a really smart Japanese guy being nuked because his crazy government had gotten into this giant war, right? So the rest of the world was artificially wrecked.
Stunted, yeah.
Exactly, that's right. That's not to say anything bad about the U.S., but it's just that there was an advantage where that high school graduate was in the one environment that hadn't been destroyed.
Right.
That's not the natural state of the world, right?
Right.
Okay. So now the world is coming back to its natural state, which is much more balanced, right? Okay. So that means the U.S. is really, in a sense, already ended as a hub for global business, but everything's kind of gotten moved out, like the manufacturing's gotten moved out, and the commerce is being moved to the cloud, and now the physical thing is kind of getting shut down. Okay. But the thing is about this, we will miss Uncle Sam when he's gone. Okay? And there's this great book called Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More on the last Soviet generation, right? And this is about what the end of the USSR felt like. And if you read this, even skim it, you'll be like, wow, this feels a lot like what's happening in America. For example, they had a term that was similar to fake news, right? They had, because what happened was at the end of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev implemented glasnost and perestroika, like free speech and freer markets. And so everybody started complaining, and now you started seeing how bad the existing system was. And so the equivalent of that is internet free speech is social media, and internet free markets is cryptocurrency. That's the glasnost and perestroika of the modern era, right? And the thing about this is the Soviet Union had no way to announce that it was on its last legs until really the last few months, right? Even March 1991, there was a vote that was held for an all-union referendum to keep the Soviet Union together. And they thought they had a majority vote, but there were a few places like Estonia that said no, and then the Soviet Union broke up like 9 months later. Yeah, that's right, December, right? After an attempted coup. Point is, we're going to miss Uncle Sam when he's gone. Nothing I'm saying here is like, oh my God, America was a great country, but we now need the version 3.0. There's Britain, there's America, and then there'll be the internet, as I'll get to, right? But first, let me talk about what's the other part of what's coming, which is the Chinese century. Okay, so who is the successor to Uncle Sam, right? Who are the heirs to American empire? China inherits the physical empire, but the internet inherits American values, okay? So let's talk about that second part, the Chinese century. So we need to first understand like what China is, okay? Now, Indians actually, a lot of the stuff I'm going to say is kind of obvious to Indians, but a lot of Americans, I understand their ego is hit by the rise of China. They think, oh, we gave everything to China, and they tend to really underrate China, and they've always got kind of a lagging indicator on it. Not everybody, again, but a lot of people. And I understand where that comes from, but just let's be completely realistic about what the state of the world is. People say, oh my God, you're a China shill. I'm a reality shill, right? Reality shill, okay? Okay, right? So, first what China is, because even if you want to compete with China, you need to understand what it is, right? So there's this set of books by this guy, Peter Zeihan, and he basically makes his cases, which I think is wrong, is China's collapsing and the U.S. is going to win by default. You don't have to do anything. And you could actually, you can read this and people will be convinced that, it's just got all this geography and the Mississippi River is going to protect America from a sovereign debt crisis and so on and so forth, right? But to just calibrate on reality, China is just the most physically formidable state in the world by far, right? For example, this is one BYD factory.
Right.
It is larger than San Francisco.
Wow.
Okay.
Just one BYD factory.
Just one. And there's actually a clip that we can play that shows an overflight, like a drone, of this. Okay. By contrast, Elon, who's amazing, can't even build a sign in San Francisco, right? Because he had to actually move out, right? So that is the level to which the American regulatory state holds things back. And China, for its many faults, does allow its companies on net to build, right?
Right. If you are interested in my conversation with India's best, then you can listen to us exclusively on Spotify also. There's a link in the description. Press it. Listen to us as you walk, as you're in the train, as you're driving, as you're working out, as you're flirting. You'll still like it.